a spectacular leader of our Middle East program. And I also just want to say about Rob Litvak, our Vice President for Scholars, who's written his own book, which will come out soon and which was quoted in a very positive way. Of course, it would be quoted in a very positive way by Tom Friedman the other day, that Rob keeps our scholar program vibrant here. We are called the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and there's no other place that I'm aware of that has scholars in its name, and we take it seriously. And so all I wanted to say was this is important. We're Jay's first appearance. We would have to be Jay's first appearance, wouldn't we? Oh, yeah. And as he gallivants around town, he will remind everybody, including his mother, that he came to the Woodrow Wilson Center first. So welcome to both of you.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, to those with us today and those who are watching us via kind of a live webcast for today's session featuring Jay's tremendous new book, The Iran Wars, Spy Games, Bank Battles, and the Secret Deals That Reshaped the Middle East. Today's meeting is co-sponsored by our Middle East program, headed by Henri Barkey, and the Director Emerita is here, Ale Esfandiari. Thank Julia Romano and Kendra Heidemann for their work today in putting this together, as well as Maria Stella Gadzoulis from Special Events of the Wilson Center. It's in collaboration as well with the Los Alamos National Laboratory. We're grateful for that continuing partnership for this, our Non-Proliferation Forum series, of which today's topic so well fits and is represented today by Dr. Joseph Pilat. And so we highly value that institutional partnership and thank them for their support of this series. For more than a decade, the United States has been engaged in a war with Iran as momentous as any other in the Middle East. A war all the more significant as has been largely hidden from public view. Through a combination of economic sanctions, global diplomacy, and intelligence work, successive U.S. administrations have struggled to contain Iran's aspirations to become a nuclear power and dominate the region, what many viewed as the most serious threat to peace in the Middle East. Meanwhile, Iran has used regional instability to its advantage to undermine America's interests. Jay Solomon's new book, The Iran Wars, is the product of his extensive in-depth reporting and interviews with all the key players in the conflict. Jay is well known in this town and beyond as the chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. For nearly 2 decades, he's written from Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, including stints in Jakarta, Indonesia, Seoul, South Korea, New Delhi, and Washington. He's been nominated for Pulitzer Prizes. He did path-breaking reporting for this book. He was the first American journalist to uncover the secret meetings between the United States and Iran that took place in Oman. We'll hear about that and other aspects of his reporting that culminated in the controversial Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the nuclear agreement between Iran and the P5+1 that is controversial because it places meaningful constraints on Iran's nuclear program, but it's only for 15 years, the main constraints, and did not address the agreement by design did not address other aspects of Iranian conduct that many in the international community, the United States and its partners find objectionable. And that is all part of Jay's treatment in this book, what he's called the Iran Wars. So over to Jay for an overview of the book, and then we'll open it up to comments and questions. And there are books for sale outside in the foyer, and Jay will be available to autograph them. So over to Jay.
Great. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I just wanted to start off by saying part of the reason I got interested in this book is one of our former colleagues who was a Wilson Fellow named Michael Adler, who was deeply engaged in the Iran issue for more than a decade. He was based for AFP before he came to Washington and was covering the International Atomic Energy Agency very closely. And he was the first one who kind of introduced me to this weird world that is Vienna and the IAEA and this very kind of Vienna spy game town where there's lots of intrigue. And unlike Washington, you can sit in a cafe at the Vienna headquarters and get all sorts of classified information from IAEA officials walking out of the board of directors meeting. So I wanted to mention Michael at the beginning because he was working on a book not totally dissimilar to mine when he died a few years ago, but he was a great influence on me. The Iran issue, just my interest, besides Michael, really peaked in the last 2 years of the Bush administration going into the Obama administration. With Bush, it was always an issue I really tried to address in the book was, there was such a fear of Iran, and yet by overthrowing Saddam Hussein and the war in Afghanistan to some sense, the U.S. really helped unleash Iran in a lot of ways, and trying to figure out, why they did that, what was the calculations regarding Iran, and you could also start to feel towards the end of the Bush administration and going into Obama that the Iran issue was dominating kind of every part of U.S. national security, from the sanctions starting to be developed, bringing in the Chinese or the Russians to help pressure Iran. The war in Lebanon in 2006 was very much part of this regional battle between what's called the axis of resistance, which is Iran, Hezbollah, the Assad regime, Shiite militias in Iraq on the one side, and the American, Israel, and some of the allies, Arab allies. And it was starting to take shape really clearly to me in 2006, 2007. And you could tell even then that new types of warfare were being created to contain the Iranian threat. The cyber warfare, the cyber attacks on the Iranian nuclear installations were the first that kind of came out. But in the book, I argue really in 2 chapters that the financial warfare that was unleashed on Iran was something the U.S. had never done before. And I think that was the driving force that had the most impact on Iran and what its calculations were. And the book, I think, in a lot of ways is about Barack Obama and why this guy from Hawaii, who lived in Indonesia, was so fixated on the Iranian agreement. And the book traces back even as far back as the 2008 campaign that Barack Obama was very focused on Iran, that it was kind of a lot of different issues were converging. I think in his mind, which I write about in the book, when he was in the Senate, non-proliferation was one issue he really kind of jumped on in the short time he was there. I also think if you look at some of his advisors, senior in the White House, like Ben Rhodes, they had worked on a project called the Iraq Study Group, and the key points of that agreement were dealing or trying to engage the Iranians and the Syrians to basically get out of Iraq in some ways, or to help stabilize it. And I think that was part of his mindset. And I think he really did believe that in the philosophy, which first came out in the 2008 election, which he was criticized, even by Hillary Clinton, that he was sort of naive, but that he could engage American adversaries. So in some of the interviews I had with White House officials, they would say, Iran was one issue where kind of all these different things converged: non-proliferation, war and peace, the future of U.S. foreign policy, and that's why he jumped on it. And the book, it was interesting showing how quickly he moved to move in that direction. He started sending what were 5 letters to the supreme leader of Iran just months after taking office. His speeches he would give on Persian New Year, this channel he was developing was very much focused on resolving the nuclear question peacefully, and in the back of his mind, U.S. officials would say this hope that they could reset the relationship. I think in a lot of ways, there were parts of this strategy were incredibly successful and do redefine U.S. national security, the way we use, whether it's sanctions or other tools to promote U.S. national interests. I think he did, the fact that he was so willing to engage Iran after 8 years of the Bush administration, where there was a lot of criticism from the Europeans and others that the U.S. wasn't able to sort of bring the Iranians to the table. I think the administration was very successful in kind of shifting that balance and putting the Iranians on the defensive from early on. And the depths of this financial warfare, it was incredibly for me to watch it from its kind of early stages, because at first the belief was you couldn't take an oil economy off the market. You couldn't. The Iranians were the second, third largest member of OPEC. There was just lots of skepticism that the U.S. could really do much financial damage to Iran. And starting with the Bush administration and into Obama, it was such a systematic kind of gradual escalation of these sanctions. At first, it was just hitting some of the big banks of Iran, and then it was going after insurance companies, airlines, reinsurance companies, shipping firms, oil and gas companies. I mean, it just got so expansive, and you could see the pressure escalating. And then the real kind of the nuclear option on the financial front was the sanctioning of the Central Bank of Iran in 2012 and the agreement by the Europeans to do an oil embargo. And to see where it started to where it went and how they were able to basically take Iran off the international energy markets and completely bar them basically from the financial system was an impressive feat, and it goes to both the Bush and the Obama administrations. And finally, I think the way the negotiations were set up over that period, there was ups and downs, there was some engagement, but the process of these kind of secret talks, which then grew to this international effort, it was set up, in my mind. It was a very effective use of kind of coercive diplomacy, you'd say, with the sanctions on the one side and then the willingness to open up. I do think there were costs to this strategy, and many of them are going to be debated for a long time. Early on, just as Obama was moving to put in place this diplomatic outreach, you had the Green Revolution of 2009 and the protest movement. And in the book, I try to weigh the real pressure that the White House, on the one hand, they were hearing from some sides that don't give any verbal support to the rebels or the opposition protesters. You'll only give the supreme leader an excuse to crack down. And others were saying he's probably going to do that anyways, and they remained pretty silent. And the crackdown and kind of this hope that there might have been some real political change, you just don't hear much that anymore. So even Hillary Clinton has said publicly if there was one thing she wished they had done differently, then it was probably not being more supportive of the Green movement. Syria obviously is also an issue. I'm personally have been sort of surprised in recent months or years where you hear so much debate about Syria and so much criticism of the Russians, the Assad regime, and the fact the Iranians tend to get a free pass in some ways when they're very much at the center of this war. They are mobilizing the ground forces behind Assad, and they have, in some ways, are running the war for Assad and have been, and they sort of get a free pass. But one of the more contentious kind of episodes in the book, I relate when the secret talks with the Iranians in the summer of 2013, in August, they were escalating at the very time that President Obama had laid down his red lines and basically said if the Assad regime uses chemical weapons, we will retaliate. And everyone knows it's history now. He backed away, and officially the kind of the message was, Congress wouldn't have supported it. He was very reluctant to get engaged, which I think is true. But Iranian officials I've talked to said that the diplomats knew that if the U.S. started to bomb Assad, targeting his air force, who was very much Iran's closest Arab ally, provided the Iranian strategic depth in the Middle East, that the supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards might have pulled the plug on the diplomacy, and that was communicated. But that episode aside, we have seen in the years since 2013, the Americans in some ways almost ally their positions with the Iranians. There was a letter that President Obama wrote to the supreme leader in 2014 where he basically said, if we can get this nuclear agreement, we can cooperate in other areas, and you should know we're not targeting the Assad regime in Syria. And that was communicated to the Iranians through other channels, through the Iraqis as well. So I think what we're seeing now, and I think one of the legacies of the Obama administration will be that they didn't act in Syria, and it's a very contentious issue. But I argue in the book that the Iran card, his outreach to the Iranians was part of his calculations, and that was certainly being communicated by the Iranian side. The agreement last year, it's obviously still very, very contentious. I think even the biggest critics in Israel or in the Arab world, most of them will say, okay, maybe it buys us 3 or 4 years, maybe a little bit more, but the general sense in the region is that this was sort of a truce, that this crisis is not abated, this doesn't end Iran's nuclear weapons capability. So that is still hanging out there. And, I think the Obama administration, on the one hand, was pretty clear saying this was just an arms control agreement, but there was, if you talk to White House officials, State Department, John Kerry, this hope that this could reset the relationship with the Iranians and build, possibly a better relationship. I think the initial signs aren't great. There has not been cooperation in Syria like there had been hope. In some ways, the Iranians have doubled down along with the Russians to support the Assad regime, and the horrific acts we're seeing there now. The Iranians continue to develop missiles. If you read the IAEA reports, they have abided by the nuclear agreement, but on the sides, you can see they're continuing to develop centrifuge machines, the missiles. So, kind of the question: why are they still doing this if they're not going to ramp up at some point? And we continue to see the arrests of dual nationals, the arrests of European Iranians, Iranian Americans. It's the rhetoric from the regime hasn't settled down at all. It's early days, so I think I try to strike a balance in making that clear that it is early days, and I think the White House, President Obama there is a political element a bet that the Supreme Leader will likely die in 4 or 5 years, and you could see a reset. So in 10 years, 15 years, when this agreement kind of expires, there won't be so much concern about Iran's military capabilities. But on the other hand, I think there is still a risk of a situation like the U.S. had with North Korea in the early 90s, where they signed a similar type agreement, basically trading economics for a suppression of a weapons program, and it kind of erodes over time because there was never really any political commitment on either side. The hostility never really died, and what are kind of transactional diplomatic relationships don't go behind that and eventually unwind. So I think that's kind of the crux of where we are, that split. And the next decade is going to be very interesting to see where this all heads. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Jake. We'll open it up for comments and questions. Could you just clarify, you said 3 to 4 years, and I'm just curious because that would, the constraints on Iranian access to weapons usable materials is for 15 years. To do 3 or 4 years, they'd have to be cheating or have a covert facility. Is that what was behind the Israeli comment, that they'd have a covert facility that we wouldn't detect, or where did the 3 to 4 come from?
It could be longer. I think that the general assessment is right now that if you're the Supreme Leader or the Revolutionary Guard, you kind of like the agreement right now. You got the sanctions lifted, which a lot of Iranian officials I talked to said the Supreme Leader at one point understood that these sanctions were a national security threat. So you have that removed. You have money coming back into the system. You still might hear, Iranian officials complain about it, but their economy is supposed to grow by 5% next year after contracting. So the first 3 or 4 years, I think most people think that it's totally in Iran's interest to stick to the agreement. They're getting the money, but at that point, you won't have the Obama administration anymore that was so invested in this program, in this deal, and as we kind of move away from, John Kerry and the people who created it, do the fringes start to fall apart?
Okay. Hala Esfandiari.
Jake, Thank you very much. Fascinating book. You didn't talk about the physicist, which is all new in the book. But a question about the topic that you broke recently in the Wall Street Journal, the 400 million that was delivered in cash. I mean, it's a puzzle to me. How, first of all, physically, how do you deliver 400 million and then the second installment in cash? And why not do a bank transfer, because it's legal? And if the first 400 million was a kind of ransom, you know, why not try and get the other dual national out before you deliver the second installment?
Right. No, this money issue and the cash payment, I think, kind of feeds into this perception that there's a risk that most of this diplomacy we saw over the last couple of years was very transactional. It was, a payoff or however you want to call it. But what we've learned in the recent weeks is that it was very coordinated. The White House initially came out and said, well, we had the prisoner exchange, we had this cash payment and some delisting of Iranian state banks. But it all kind of happened around the same time, but it wasn't coordinated. But now we've found out that the nuclear agreement was implemented on January 16th. The next day, a senior State Department official signed 3 documents in Geneva with representatives of the Iranian Ministry of Intelligence that basically said, okay, we're going to drop charges on 21 Iranian nationals, and these 4 Americans will be released. We will begin the process of moving this $1.7 billion, including $400 million immediately, and we will delist Bank SEPA, which was one of the biggest state banks. The process of it was interesting. The first $400 million went through the Central Bank of Switzerland in francs, and the Iranians sent a plane to Geneva, and it was sequenced. Apparently $400 million in Swiss francs is a lot, but I forgot what denomination it was. It wasn't like the plane was loaded to the ground. It was small enough that they could get it out of there pretty easily. And then that was January 17th. And then the rest, 1.3 billion in euros, went through the Dutch central bank. And we're still trying to find out if the Iranians sent planes we assume to Amsterdam to pick up that money, and it went back to Iran on February 5th and January 19th. But we can't really, I haven't been able to get a good answer from the administration, because first they were saying, well, we had to pay it in cash because we had no banking relationships. But then we found out they actually have wired money to Iran in the past year to settle other disputes in euros, not in dollars, but they have done it. They are capable of doing it. So I think that's a question they haven't answered, and I think the Iranians were saying we want that cash now, and I think there's a real risk that money could have easily gone to Syria or Hezbollah. I mean, that's always the concern in the Treasury Department when they talk to other countries is don't use cash. So the fact that they did it's something I think they still haven't really answered.
But the 1.7 billion originated from the sale of arms under the Shah, and what State Department officials were saying as well was we were on the cusp of having the International Court rule that we'd pay it back plus up to $10 billion in penalties. So it was in your piece,
Right.
and it was clear, but sort of the bumper sticker coming out of it was, and it sort of plays into the prism of the Iran nuclear deal in our politics, is we paid ransom for it, when that money was Iranian money, which could have gone back to them with a substantial penalty or of interest. And so in a sense, one could view it as they cut a good deal to cut that out. And then the other money issue that's come up is the bumper sticker is we've given, quote unquote, given the Iranians $150 billion, which was, as you pointed out, we cut off Iran's access to selling oil, but there was a process, and during that time of being implemented, they racked up $150 billion in selling their oil on the international market, and the $150 billion is basically allowing them access to an escrow account for oil that we permitted them to sell on the international market. So the money issue has gotten tied into this sort of ransom bit. I think you've been careful in your reporting of disaggregating it, but how it's been used by, I mean, it's invariably, it's going to be used by proponents and opponents of the regime. And I think that's a comment, but I could put a question mark at the end of it. But any reaction to how your reporting is used in the politics of the Iran deal? Because it's invariably going to be the case.
Yeah. Well, I could say after writing the book and doing this type of reporting, anything on Iran is politically toxic. There's virtually no middle ground. So I've felt in reporting, you can't try to shade anything because of the political fallout. You just try to write the facts as straight as you possible and let it fall. The history of this money is fascinating, and I think what we're going to see, that 400 million traces back, like you said, to a failed arms deal in the Shah, and over the past 40 years, that money, I know that money was raised during the Iran-Contra scandal. Those guys the Iranians wanted their money back then. There have been victims of Iranian-backed terrorism that have tried to seize that money and put liens on that money while it was still in the Pentagon. So the question of whose money was it? Some of these people say, no, that should have been our money. And I think there's still so many lawsuits against Iran, including one lodged this week by the Washington Post reporter Jason Rezaian, and the U.S. seized $2 billion of Iranian central bank money, and they're still trying to get their hands on that. So I think this stuff is not going to go away. It's going to keep reverberating, and it's never clear cut.
Jane Harmon.
Well, this is fascinating. I remember the administration correcting the assessment of what was owed and knocking it down to, I forget, from 1 point. I don't know if I have millions or billions anymore, but knocking it down to about 50 billion owed from 150. Yet more seems to have been paid, and I just wonder how you computed this and what the basis was for knocking it down and saying we don't actually owe all that money.
Well, I mean, I think sometimes things get confused. During the sanctions, there was between 150 and 100 billion of Iran's oil money that was frozen in Japan. That money, there's been a lot of debate. I think the general assessment now is Iran will get 100 billion back, but 50 billion of that is already locked up in money they owed China or development projects. So it's maybe half of that is liquid. So there was that money. And then the separate issue was this dispute between the U.S. and Iran going back to the Shah's time over these arms, this 400 million that was being arbitrated in The Hague. And like Ed was saying, the money was initially, it could have been 10 billion. That's what the U.S. says. It could have been 10 billion, but they negotiated out of court and resolved on 1.7 billion. So I mean, it's hard to tell because it's always hard to say you're going to lose. You're going to lose a case, but that's what they've argued.
Let's get some questions in the back, and please identify yourself and your institutional affiliation.
My name's Phil Carrata. In fact, I used to work with Michael Adler at AFP in Paris 30 years ago, and I'm very sorry to hear that he died. In the last few years, or at the end of the Bush administration, there were widespread rumors that the Bush administration was preparing a military attack on Iran because of its nuclear program. Can you shed any light on what you know about those rumors or of military action against Iran, and what the facts you know about them, and whether the military action would have been a wise decision? Thank you.
In the course of this reporting, I kind of generally looked back on the U.S.-Iran conflict since the revolution, and I personally was kind of struck more by the idea that the U.S. actually has been, when it comes to Iran and an actual military strike, I think they've been extremely restrained, whether it was after the 79 revolution or the bombing of the Marine barracks in Lebanon in 83, or some of the stuff during the Iraq War where the U.S. could see the fact that Iran was shipping IEDs and other munitions into Iraq to target U.S. forces. I believe that the U.S. has actually always been pretty restrained because they know that a war with Iran would be incredibly destabilizing. So I personally never found in my reporting that either the Bush or the Obama administration was on the cusp of, bombing Iran or going to take out the nuclear installations. I think the bigger issue was, were the Israelis going to do something, and that was the potential for an escalation. And there was a period, like Hale raised the issue of the assassination of these nuclear scientists in Iran, which the Iranians blamed on Israel. There was a period, sort of 2011, 2012, where these assassinations were happening. The Iranians and their proxies were retaliating. There was plots from Mombasa to New Delhi to Bangkok to Georgetown, traced back to the Revolutionary Guard. There was a bombing in Bulgaria where Israeli tourists were struck. But I think if there was going to be a military conflict, it likely would have been either the Israelis striking the installations or some sort of escalation that the U.S. got dragged into. It was interesting. Shimon Peres died last week, the former Israeli prime minister and president, and he kind of from the grave, before he died, he had given an interview to the Jerusalem Post where he said he personally basically walked Prime Minister Netanyahu back from military strikes against Israel in 2011. I'm a little skeptical, but that's what he said. I still think the Israeli Defense Forces they knew how limited an impact strikes might have happened, but that still is a question that's out there. And related back to the U.S., I've talked to White House officials who recount this opening of a secret channel to the Iranians in 2012. Part of it was, yes, they wanted to end this diplomatically, but there was also a sense that a diplomatic process would kind of hamstring the Israelis if they were thinking of doing anything. It would have been very difficult for the Israelis to launch strikes when the U.S. was in a diplomatic engagement, and eventually the world was in a diplomatic engagement with Iran. So that's how I see the history of the potential for military strikes.
Malcolm Byrne, then we'll come over here, and then there's a question in the back.
Malcolm Byrne from the National Security Archive at GW University. I wonder if I could just press you a little bit on that. First of all, are you talking about a war or military strikes that are intended not to lead to war? As a point of history, in the mid-'80s, we now have evidence from NSPG minute notes and so on that Reagan was in fact ready, at least so he said, to strike against Iran if the hostages in Lebanon were to be put on trial or start to be executed or something like that. So I think there is some basis for thinking that the U.S. has been more ready to consider this kind of action in the past. Does that make you, does your perception of the unlikelihood of this kind of action make you think that the Obama administration was disingenuous in its stated concerns about preventing this kind of thing? And finally, if we are so unlikely to react in this way, what does that suggest to you about the options on the table for future presidents in 10 or 15 years if the Iranians choose to pursue a full-fledged nuclear weapons program?
Right. Well, you raised the mid-'80s. I mean, I do think there's been definitely pressure there. I remember hearing George Shultz talk years ago, but he was pressing for retaliation when the Marine barracks were hit when he was Secretary of State, and Cass Weinberger and the Pentagon said no. So there's been that tension. It hasn't it's not like it hasn't been there, but I just think the fact that it didn't happen tells you how much concern there would be about kind of what the fallout would be. With the Obama administration, I felt the way the agreement was sold in last year, I felt it was a bit disingenuous because it's either this deal or a war. I mean that's how it was. It was sold as an anti-war as much as it was as a disarmament or a non-proliferation agreement. I felt in 2015 I just didn't really understand who was going to start the war. I think most of the Israelis I've talked to said by the window that they could have really have done maybe some damage had closed by 2013 or 14 because so much had moved underground. And I think the scenario I've heard from John Kerry was, well, if there wasn't an agreement and the process collapsed, the Iranians would immediately start escalating their program again, and the U.S. would have to jack up sanctions, and then that could you could have a precipitous fall, and then you'd have a war. I think if the process broke down, the more likely scenario was things would have been quiet for 3 or 4 months, but the sanctions were so biting that the process probably would have started up again. But that's going to be debated for a while. But the kind of war, I think the way they sold the Iran deal is not totally dissimilar to how they've talked about Syria in some ways. It was kind of like, well, it's going to either be like an Iraq type operation or we're going to do nothing. And I felt that the polarities are not necessary. They're easy to sell. I don't think they're necessarily true. There's often something in between.
This gentleman and then across.
Thank you very much. I'm Mike Albin. I'm an independent researcher. Could you give us an idea of the actual interpersonal goings-on in the negotiations, which has been a kind of a footnote to all of this, that there were tensions and eruptions and temper tantrums and so forth on one side or the other? What was that like?
The delegations were interesting because when the talks started as secret negotiations, it was led by Hillary Clinton's kind of boy wonder, a guy named Jake Sullivan, who was in his early 30s, I think, when this started, and Bill Burns, who was a much more seasoned diplomat, and they were basically running the negotiations until there was an interim agreement in the fall of 2013, at which point John Kerry really took over with Wendy Sherman, who was his deputy. But it was, I think, the dynamics were interesting. I think the Iranian side, there was always a game, certainly amongst journalists, trying to figure out who was who. Like Zarif was very much this colorful, the foreign minister, colorful, very westernized, easy to talk to diplomat who was on the headlines. But his deputy was a guy named Abbas Aranchi, who there was a feeling that he was closer to the Revolutionary Guard. Maybe he was a bit more into that circle. And then there was the head of the Atomic Energy Agency, his name was Ali Akbar Salehi, who sometimes take part in the talks and sometimes wouldn't. But he also was a very important figure behind the screen. But it was Kerry and Zarif. I think even today they probably at times speak 2-3 times a day. They developed this incredibly close relationship. Critics would say the Iranians kind of understood the Americans more than the other way around. Zarif had studied at San Francisco and Denver. Another one, Salehi, had been at MIT. They understood the Americans, they understood America, and they seemed to understand our politics. I don't know. I think one of my criticisms in the book was that the Iranians were very adept at sort of playing good cop, bad cop. You'd have diplomats in Vienna talking about constraining the nuclear program down to 5,000 centrifuges, and then the supreme leader would give a speech in Tehran and say, no, we need 100,000. And I think the Iranians, what I would hear, they'd say, like, well, we're not in control of this guy, but we have to deal with it. He's the ultimate decision maker. And I think they were good at playing that game. And if you look at the final agreement, the Americans will say, well, we did get them down to 5,000 centrifuges, but the supreme leader will say, well, in 10 years, I'm going to get 100,000 centrifuges. So who won? That's going to be unclear. But I found sometimes I didn't think the U.S. side used the congressional carrot enough, because you did have Republicans, chomping at the bit, saying, I remember there was a key moment in sort of late 2013 where Congress wanted to pass legislation that basically said, if there's no deal in 1 year, we're going to put these sanctions on Iran in a year. And the legislation was written so that there were waivers. Like the president, if there was he could have used it, but instead of kind of using it as a kind of a knife hanging over the Iranian side, they vetoed it, or said they were going to veto it. So part of the negotiating tactics never totally made sense to me, because they took out that threat of sanctions, which could have been used as leverage. They started to talk down sanctions even though even today the financial sanctions are still kind of holding in some ways. They were saying, well, the sanctions can't hold. Oil prices were collapsing, and the you had all of this in play, and I think that meant the U.S. had a lot of leverage, and they kind of talked it away. I thought they would have been playing up the potential for more sanctions down the road, and they basically wrote off the military option. So once you started to get a feel that they were taking these other levers off the negotiating table, I don't know, I think 6-7 months before there was an agreement, I started to feel it was inevitable, because there was really, the alternatives were kind of disappearing.
But under the deal, they can't go up to 100,000 centrifuges in 10 years.
Well, I mean, at
mean,
some
you know.
point, it's unrestrained. They can have an industrial scale program.
I'm just curious, like, alternatives between this deal and war. The British were saying, the sanctions, we're at the high water mark of sanctions. There was the call for in the Senate for the better deal. Right. That was the headline. But it wasn't really clear. It was never laid out what the better deal would be, that the coercive pressure could be applied for. I mean, and that a full rollback of the program wasn't feasible. Do you have any sense of what? I mean, if they had exerted the coercive pressure more effectively, kind of what kinds of extra things could have been in there that they weren't able to get? Do you think?
Well, I mean, I think one thing people might not have fully understand was that the real sanctions on Iran, the really nasty ones, were really only in effect for about 12 months. Mm-hmm. That was the oil embargo, sanctioning the Central Bank of Iran, and kicking Iran off the the SWIFT banking network. That happened in mid-2012, and then the negotiations really picked up in 2013. So it was 12, 17 months. At that point, their currency fell by 2/3. Their oil exports fell by more than half. I know the French during the negotiations were kind of saying, look, you've got all this leverage. Why not take a pass or take a breather at some point and let the Iranians kind of look at where their situation is? I guess the point you make is a good one. Could there have been a better deal? I think that the most criticism, I think, that have some validity are that the program is supposed to be just about the nuclear issue, and then at the end they kind of throw in, well, in 8 years the missile sanctions come off. In 5 years the arms embargo are lifted. This completely came out of nowhere to reporters. How did that suddenly get thrown in? And there was a huge focus for years on the weaponization issue. What exactly did the Iranians do? And the final agreement the Iranians had to do 5 or 6 things that they kind of checked off, but they never really cooperated. And one of the most interesting parts, I think, of the book is that there was this back and forth over whether the IAEA would be allowed into this military base in Parchin. And it was, in the end, it was a weird kabuki dance where the Iranians kind of did the sampling themselves, and then they handed it over to the IAEA. But even then, they found uranium in those traces, and it was kind of just forgotten. I think 3 or 4 years ago, that would have been a smoking gun. So I think some of the stuff that got thrown in there at the end, basically, I would argue, whitewashing the issue of militarization, the arms embargo. I think some of these things could come back to haunt people, and some of these things they could have maybe held out for a harder line on.
Good. I'd like to take 4 more questions, and then we'll have time, 5, sorry, to these 5, and then we'll have time for Jay to sign books. So let's just start in the back and then work forward all the way in the back, and then, John, why don't we collect?
All right.
Good.
Alexander Gertz, junior scholar at the Wilson Center. I have one question. In the context of the problematic relations between the US and Iran we see today, how do you evaluate the CIA-backed coup back in '53 against Mossadegh and the installation of the Shah, which then later led to the revolution of Khomeini? Thank you.
Well, I wasn't there. I do know this, though. I know in these letters that President Obama wrote to the Supreme Leader, he definitely sort of made this argument that, yes, the U.S. has wronged Iran in the past, and that there's a recognition of this, and that we can build a better relationship. So the concerns the Iranians have constantly raised about the 53 coup and other issues, they have been, President Obama did address them. So it's not like this type of, the issue you raise has not been part of these negotiations. It was definitely mentioned and talked about.
These competitive apologies, we're waiting for ours on the seizing of the hostages. So this gentleman here.
Hi, Mark Mayerson, aspiring informed citizen. I hate to be obtuse, but what precisely is the problem with Iran's having nuclear weapons? We're seeing Kashmir heat up. Iran doesn't need nukes to attack Israel, given that they're 10 times the size of Israel. Having nuclear weapons seems to be the disincentive to militarize regime change, as we can see with Libya giving up its weapons of mass destruction versus North Korea. But this has just always been the premise. We have to stop them from having nuclear weapons, but I don't quite understand why that is of great value.
Thank you. Why don't we collect the next two questions, and we'll give Jay an opportunity to bundle some answers. Go ahead.
Thank you. I look for, it's Ken Button. I'm a retired private sector economist. I look forward to reading your book, but I must say I see there's an elephant in the room in the sense of Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has not been mentioned in any of the commentary right now, but I imagine in the minds of the Iranians and their foreign policy concerns, Saudi Arabia would probably be amongst them. Could you give us your view of that point?
Sure.
Let's do one more. The woman two behind, okay, and then.
Hi, Claudia Maffetone. I am the program manager of Track 2 at Search for Common Ground. My question is about internal politics in Iran. How do you think the dynamics between the moderates and the conservatives affect some of the statements and actions of the moderates in this situation? Thank you.
Okay. Why nukes, Saudi Arabia, and the moderates?
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well, the nukes issue is, I've heard that reasoning. I think the fear is that the way this deal was structured is that if you're Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt, you're going to be looking at what Iran's capacity is going to be in 10 or 15 years and their ability to produce nuclear fuel, the missiles that they're developing, that it's going to cause kind of a proliferation cascade. That's been the administration says they don't believe it, that this deal is actually going to cap the program and these other countries, will be appeased, or they'll see that. That's not the kind of the sense I get from speaking with Arab officials, but there is this risk, I think, that other countries will say they have to match it. India, Pakistan's an interesting example. I was based in India at one point, but I do remember when the Pakistanis tested a nuclear weapon in '98. The next year they invaded Kashmir, Kargil, this war at 20,000 feet or whatever it was. But the perception at the time was that the Pakistanis, because they had a nuclear deterrent, were more aggressive conventionally. And I think that's one of the fears with Iran, that if they're going to have this kind of latent nuclear capability, they're going to be even more aggressive in supporting militias. I mean, they are aggressive across the region, from Lebanon to the Palestinian territories to Yemen. They're playing in all these theaters, and if they have a nuclear deterrent, even if they haven't demonstrated it, it could give them this kind of cover to do more lethal conventional arms. Saudi Arabia's, it is in the book quite a bit, because I think there's so much focus on the Israeli-Iranian conflict. It kind of discounts how opposed the Arabs were in a lot of ways to this diplomacy. They did cooperate in the financial war in ways that I thought were really interesting. In the book, I trace back the early years where the White House started to send diplomats to China and India and say, look, if you stop buying Iranian oil, if you kind of pull back your investments, we're going to get the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Kuwaitis to crank up their oil production. And it has been used as a weapon. I mean, the Saudis have definitely used energy as a weapon, and it's you still see it playing out in OPEC in a lot of ways. So the Saudis are definitely they were a big player, even though they weren't as vocal as the Israelis were in opposing the deal. A lot of Arabs, Saudi officials I've talked to were, they're very skeptical about this agreement, and the fact that the Iranians are kind of coming back into the global economy is something they see as a threat, and the tensions between those two countries have not simmered down at all, as you've probably seen. It's escalating, so that is a worry going forward.
And there was a question about the moderates, and
Yeah.
I mean, in our campaign, we've had presidential candidates say they would jettison the agreement day one, which raises the question, what happens day two? But anyway, you have moderates and conservatives, many who've been critical of the deal. Do they have their version of those who'd say, if there's a presidential election in Iran and there's a shift from Rouhani, that day one they would do something about it? Or how do you see that playing out?
I mean, it's playing out in a lot of ways right now. I know the White House position has been this agreement will embolden President Rouhani and his foreign minister, and the growth of their economy will sort of play to the youthful population in Iran, which is very large. The revolutionaries in that country are aging. This generation will kind of pass. But I also think at the same time you've seen the hardliners, if you will, kind of pushing back. I thought it was interesting in New York 2 weeks ago. I know the White House had this hope that at the end of the Obama term there'd be that magic moment where President Obama shakes President Rouhani's hand. And Iranian officials I talked to said it was very much calculated that President Rouhani would not be in New York at the same time as President Obama, because they didn't want that moment because of his concerns about being attacked from the right inside his own country, and they have presidential elections next year. So I think that this hope is imbued in the agreement was that this will empower more moderate factors. The opening of the economy will eventually do that. That is a longer term bet in it, and it could happen. But I think you see the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards. They're definitely trying to keep these moderates in check. And I think some of the arrests you've seen of Iranian Americans, I think, are very targeted. I think some of the debate, which is the Iranians have been kind of attacking the U.S., saying, well, you haven't given us enough money. We're not getting the economic benefits. But if your own security forces are throwing in jail Iranian Americans who want to do business, you're basically causing a problem for yourself. And I think that's part of these internal politics that are playing out. I don't think the Supreme Leader wanted a flood of Western money coming in to his country. I think he saw that as as big a threat as a collapse. I think he might be modulating it about right now. He's getting money to the point there's not going to be a collapse, but the flood of Western money ideas he's trying to keep at bay. Whether he will be able to longer terms, unclear.
Thank you, Jay. The book, The Iran Wars, copies available for purchase outside. Please join me in thanking Jay for an excellent presentation today. In this country, say, Obama receives further instructions from President Rouhani.
He would have gotten slammed.
Good job. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I was there 2003 to.
And there's a